first things first, remove the engine cover. Just pull straight up on it, set that aside. Now we have access to the top of the intake. So looking down, you'll notice first of all that my upper radiator hose is not routed this way, and I only removed it for the video. You do not have to remove this, but I could not get the camera around my arms and around the radiator hose all at the same time so you can see what I'm doing. This is the only reason I removed this. Do not remove your radiator hose for this. But anyway, here's your throttle body. It's gonna have a clamp. You can see that right there. Attaches this intake tube to the throttle body itself, so let's remove that. You can either use an 8mm or a flathead screwdriver. I'm just gonna go for the flathead screwdriver. And when I say remove, I don't actually mean remove. I mean remove the hose, which means loosening the clamp a little bit. Okay, now you can take this intake hose, wiggle it to break it free. Looks like it has a electrical connector attached underneath there. Go ahead and remove that. Now you can pull it straight off and just move it to the side. Down there, you'll see an electrical connector for the throttle body. Let's unplug it. Next, get this wiring harness off of the intake here. There you go. You're going to need to remove your dipstick because we need access through this hole to get to one of the mounting bolts. Next, I'm going to disconnect the fuel rail. It's easy to do this. Just make sure that if your car ran recently, there will be fuel pressure here. So keep that in mind. Press on the green locking tab here. Disconnect the fuel line. And I'm just going to move it out of the way over here. There will be fuel pressure if your car ran recently. I just had a little bit of leftover fuel, but usually it sprays out. Next, I want to disconnect the fuel injectors. To do that, you want to pull up on this red locking tab. There we go. And you can grab it, disconnect it. Do this to all of them. And let's pull this harness off of the studs here so we can move it out of the way. There we go. Over here, go ahead and disconnect this electrical connector. Pull up on the locking tab. There we go, set that aside. So this is going to be pretty hard to see even in person, but there are 2 nuts on each side that hold this intake on, as well as 3 bolts. They're all 13mm in size. You can either use a flashlight and try to find them, or kind of fish for them with your extension. Like I said, 1 nut on each side. I'm going to start on the outside and work my way in to loosen. If you have a magnet, it will make this a lot easier because you can just fish the hardware out. Just going to break them all free and then get them all out with a magnet. And right here by the throttle body, there's this bracket that holds on the throttle body with its bolts onto the intake. So let's just remove this. It's a 13mm bolt. Now you can grab onto the intake, slowly pull it away. Just make sure that all of your wiring and all that is out of the way. This connector right here is getting kind of stretched, the wiring for it, so I'm just going to go ahead and unplug it. Okay, pull this out of the way. Okay, so we're getting hung up on this wiring here. Push this over, just like that. Okay. Now I didn't disconnect this hose on purpose because what I want to do is just pull it up and disconnect it now when it's easier. Okay, take that one out. Take this one out, and over here looks like there's one hose on this. There's a hose on the back side here. Take that out as well. Here's your intake assembly. Set that aside. And now right down here you can see the knock sensor. So let's unplug it. 13mm socket, remove it. Remember which direction it's facing, that way you can put it back the same way so the wiring harness doesn't have to be at an awkward angle. Okay, now you want to make sure that this surface is nice and clean so that the new knock sensor can mount and take a proper reading. Okay, looks pretty good. Let's get the new one. All right, slide your bolt through your new knock sensor. Let's thread this on all the way and then torque it to 195 inch-pounds. It's important to torque this to proper spec because if it's over-tightened or under-tightened, that'll affect how it reads, and obviously you don't want it to be reading incorrectly. Go ahead and plug it in. While I'm at it, hold the knock sensor to make sure it doesn't spin with the bolt. Right there. Also, don't put anything on the threads such as anti-seize, grease, thread locker. Just leave them bare. Next, I'm going to cover up the portholes with some rags. I don't want any debris getting in here while I clean up the surface, which is important to do because otherwise the new gasket might not seal up properly. Now you take a razor blade and clean up all this debris here. Now don't go too far because we have to attach these two hoses right here. The larger, wider hose went on the top nipple here. Press that on all the way. Then you have this other hose that's smaller that goes on the bottom right here. Make sure that's also pressed on all the way. Now take your intake, lower it down into position. Make sure that all of your wiring is clear. Bring it around this side bracket here. Now there should still be the two studs that will help you line up the intake. Make sure none of this wiring gets pinched. And now you just have to lift it and slide it onto those two studs, just like this. I'm going to go ahead and connect the fuel rail and the fuel input line. Make sure it clicks. I'm going to do this first, that way it stops dripping fuel and making a lot of fuel smell everywhere. And since I'm dealing with fuel-related things, let's plug the injectors in. Oops, the harness is going on the wrong side here. Okay. Make sure your harness is on this side of the intake, not on this side, or the fuel rail. Now we can plug in the injectors, slide the connector down, make sure it clicks. Don't forget to lock it. Over here I had to unplug this connector to make my harness reach a little further, so I'm just going to go ahead and plug this back in. Make sure that clicks, and then take this PCV hose, slide it into the valve cover, secure this wiring harness up here. I'm going to connect this sensor here as well. Make sure that locks. Okay, with a magnet, I'm going to try and get the hardware back in. So the 3 bolts are in. I'm going to snug those up with a ratchet. I don't want to tighten them yet. I just want to bring the intake closer. So I'll just bottom them out. All right, so now the intake is seated flush up against the engine block. So all we have to do is put on the 2 nuts, one on each side, and then we can torque this in the proper sequence at the proper torque spec. It's important to do that. That way you get a nice tight seal. All right, so all of the hardware is snugged up. Now let's get the torque spec and properly torque it. Torque these 3 bolts and the 2 nuts to 200 inch-pounds. That converts to 16.7 foot-pounds. So I'm going to start in the middle. There is a sequence to this. You start in the middle, go here, then there, then here. I'm just going to double check them all, going from one side to the other. There is one more mounting bolt that we can't forget about, and that sits right on this bracket that attaches to the throttle body. So insert that, thread it in. All right, that's bottomed out. Just make sure it's nice and snug. go ahead and put the dipstick back in. Go ahead and plug in the throttle body. Make sure the connector clicks. And then bring down this intake tube and set it over the throttle body, just like that. Let's snug up that clamp. Nice and tight. And then this wiring harness gets connected onto the bottom of this little intake tube just so it doesn't dangle around.